Thread seems like one of the simplest bookbinding materials. But once you start looking for it, you find linen, cotton, polyester, waxed and non-waxed thread, different thicknesses and numbers on the labels that are not always easy to understand. So in this video I will show you the threads I actually use and compare what matters when choosing one for a book. Hi, I'm Joanna. Welcome or welcome back to my missredfox paper art channel. It's all about bookbinding and paper crafts for beginners here. For most beginner projects, choosing thread does not need to be complicated. I mainly look at four things: what the thread is made from, how thick it is, if it works or not, and, especially with an exposed binding, how I want it to look. I use linen most of the time, but I also have cotton, metallic thread, and a waxed polyester thread to compare. Linen thread. Linen is my first choice for bookbinding. It is strong, durable, and handles repeated pulling through sewing holes very well. For most of my books, I use linen from Garn & Mare in 0.5 and 1 mm. The 0.5 mm thread is quite versatile. The 1 mm version is much more visible, especially as a colored version, so I use it when I want the sewing to become a stronger part of the design. These are simply the sizes that work well for the books I make. They are not universal bookbinding sizes. I also have some Irish linen thread and still have this old color and thickness chart. It's useful to see how many different options there can be even within one type of thread. And this French linen thread, I'll talk about it later. Cotton thread. Cotton can also work for bookbinding. I have cotton thread in different colors, also from Garn & Mare in 1 mm, and even some baker's twine, and I also have some ordinary stitching cotton. I find cotton softer and fuzzier than linen, so I definitely wax it before sewing. And with cotton, I take care when I pull tight to make a knot because it can break much easier than linen. Polyester or viscose thread. I also ordered some waxed polyester thread to compare. Synthetic thread can be very strong and consistent, although I personally usually prefer the feel of linen, and I don't really like how this one feels. It's very slippery. And then I have these metallic threads also from Garn & Mare. These are very much more decorative for me, and they are not made of twisted strands except for the silver one. And you can see what happens with the twisted metallic thread. But these are braided threads. And look how the tails look, they don't open or fray like this one. I use them when I specifically want the sewing to stand out, and I mainly use them for Japanese binding because I only have to make one knot in the end. They can be more difficult to knot, and because of the structure of the thread, the knot can also be less secure. This is how it looks like. I used 2 strands, and I only have one knot here. So to conclude on the topic of thread material, I wouldn't say that one fiber is always right and another is always wrong. The question is whether the thread works well for the structure of the book and for the look you want. But in general, linen is one of the best options that you have for bookbinding. How thick should the thread be? There is no one correct thread thickness. Thicker thread creates a stronger and more visible sewing pattern that can look beautiful on an exposed binding, but it also adds more bulk at the spine. And thicker doesn't automatically mean stronger. A finer thread can already be very strong. A finer thread creates a quieter, more delicate result and can work better for small books or pamphlet bindings. So instead of asking what is the correct thickness for bookbinding, I would ask how visible do I want the sewing to be, and does this thread thickness suit the size of the book? I often simply hold the thread next to the cover before deciding. Thread numbers are confusing. This is the part that can make thread shopping unnecessarily complicated. You'll see several different numbering systems, and unfortunately they don't all mean the same thing. I don't have thread marked like this right now, but one system you'll often see with linen thread, specifically sought for bookbinding, is something like 18/3 or 40/2 or 50/4. This is a system called the English Lee count. Here, the number before the slash tells you the thread size, and the number after the slash tells you the number of plies. So 40/3 means a 3-plied thread. Then a 40/3 is finer than a 25/3, which is finer than 18/3. So the larger the first number, the finer the thread. In this system, the first number relates to lengths per weight, and it represents how many 300-yard lengths of base yarn weigh 1 pound. So like this, a 50-gram spool may have 140 meters of thread on it, or 400 meters, depending on the thickness of the thread. The first number refers to the thread's count or size, but the system also depends on the type of thread. So 40/3 and 40/4 are not simply the same thickness. They have a different number of plies, which is given by the second number after the slash. So if you are comparing threads, I would always check the manufacturer's information rather than trying to work out the thickness from the number alone. And don't assume that every number you see on a spool follows this system. For example, I have some French linen from chinois labeled simply number 40. And I recently ordered these cablé linen threads labeled 332, 432, 532, and 632. Those numbers belong to a different system. Within this particular range, the larger the number means a finer thread. So my 332 is the thickest and the 632 is the finest. This is the 332, the thickest one, and this is the 632, the finest one. So you can see why simply saying I use number 40 doesn't tell you very much unless you also know which numbering system the manufacturer is using. When you are shopping for thread, I would always look for the manufacturer's thickness information, a chart or an actual diameter in millimeters. And if you are comparing threads from different systems, don't try to compare the numbers directly. Compare the actual thickness instead. So like here, this is the 0.5 millimeter thread, and this is a 1 millimeter thread, and it's quite an easy system to understand. What does ply mean? You may also see things like 2 ply, 3 ply, or 4 ply on thread labels. This is a different way to indicate it. The other one I mentioned before was the 2 or 3 or a 4 after the slash. Ply simply tells you how many strands have been twisted together to make the thread. But ply alone doesn't tell you the final thickness. 2 different 3-ply threads can still have very different diameters. So again, I would look at the manufacturer's information and if possible compare the actual thread rather than trying to work it out from the numbers alone. So this is the chart I have for some Irish linen thread, and they have a 4-ply version. So these are made from 4 strands of yarn, but they also have 2-ply, 3-ply, 7-ply, and even 12-ply, which I find too thick for bookbinding. So this is 4-ply thread, and you can see, if in doubt, just open the thread and count how many strands it has. So you can see this is a 4-ply, and this one is a 7-ply, which is also a bit too thick for bookbinding, but it depends on the book that you make, of course. Chinois and cablé linen. Chinois is a historic French thread brand. The name comes from this Chinese figure, traditionally used on the old labels, but this doesn't mean that the thread itself comes from China. The cablé threads are tightly twisted round linen threads. They aren't specifically made only for bookbinding, but I wanted to compare them with the linen I normally used. And cablé means that there are double twisted threads. So I will try to show you. This one here is made from 2 very thin threads twisted together, and this one as well, and this one as well. And then they are all twisted together a second time. I haven't used this to tell you which one I prefer for the particular binding, so I want to test them first. But they seem to be very strong, probably also because of their construction, and they are already a bit waxed, and this one as well, the filo chinois, very strong. So I will test them and see how I like them. Waxed or unwaxed? I usually buy my everyday linen thread unwaxed and wax it myself. I cut the lengths I need and then pull it over beeswax a few times. Wax helps keep the fibers together and gives me more control while sewing. Cotton threads especially benefit from waxing because otherwise they can get quite fuzzy. Some thread are already waxed, like some linen from specific brands or the polyester thread, so check the thread before adding more. I don't really like ready waxed thread because it can be very stiff, and like this I can't control how much wax I need. So you don't need a thick layer of wax. I just want enough to lightly coat the thread to make it more flexible, and this is all. So this is why I prefer to buy unwaxed thread and wax it myself. Choosing color. Color matters, especially when the sewing remains visible. With exposed bindings, I treat the thread as a part of the design. I often pick one of the colors already present in a decorative paper, so here I would pick either yellow or teal, and I picked teal. Or I choose a deliberate contrast. For example, with an indigo and white or black and white Japanese paper or fabric, I might use red thread. And I also chose red end papers. So I'm not only asking, does this color match or do I like this color, but I'm also asking, do I want the sewing to blend in or stand out? Which thread for which binding? For Coptic bindings, the sewing is very visible, so both thickness and color matters. My 0.5mm linen works well for many of my Coptic books, and if I want a much stronger decorative effect, I may use the 1mm thread. So this one is sewn with the 0.5mm thread, and this one is sewn with the 1mm thread. For Japanese step binding, the thread is also a major visual element. A larger book with a simple sewing pattern can handle a more substantial thread, while a smaller or more intricate pattern may look better with something finer. And you also have to consider how many times the thread passes through the same hole. As you can see here, the thread passes a lot of times, 5 times or even more, through one hole. So if you are using a very thick thread for the Japanese binding with lots of passes through, that hole needs to be large enough to accommodate it. I once made a quite heavy A3 Japanese bound photo album, and I used 3 strands of 1mm thread to bind it. So these are my preferences rather than strict rules. A few common problems. If the thread becomes very fuzzy while sewing, especially when you use cotton, waxing may help. But also check whether the holes are too small or whether the needle eye is rubbing against the thread. If you use very thick thread, make sure the holes are large enough, especially in Japanese binding, where the thread may pass through the same hole several times. And with a very long thread, I occasionally let the needle hang so the thread can untwist. Small things like this make sewing much more pleasant. Where to buy bookbinding thread? You can find dedicated bookbinding thread at specialist bookbinding suppliers as well as online. I can write down the shops where I buy my thread in the description. Depending on where you live, you may find it at bookbinding and conservation suppliers or craft shops, but even on Etsy and similar marketplaces. Specialist bookbinding suppliers often list the sizes quite clearly and may also give you the approximate diameter and the length on the spool. But you don't always have to buy a whole spool. Many smaller shops and Etsy sellers will send 10 or 20 meter or yards of a particular thread. I think this is a very good option when you are trying a new thread. You can test the color, thickness and how it behaves while sewing before buying a large spool with 50 or 100 or more meters. It can save you money, and after all, you may discover that you simply don't like the thread. What should a beginner buy? After all these options, my everyday choice is actually very simple. For most books, I use linen in 0.5 and 1 mm. I buy these unwaxed and wax them myself. I also have cotton and metallic thread and Irish linen, the French filo chinois and cablé linen threads, and the wax polyester thread to experiment with. But that collection has accumulated over years. A beginner does not need all of this. So if you are just starting, I would buy one good linen thread in a medium thickness. Something around 0.5 to 0.7 mm is a useful starting point for many small and medium handmade books. If you mainly want to make tiny books, you may prefer something finer. And if you love exposed Coptic or Japanese sewing, you may enjoy something slightly more substantial. Choose 1 or 2 colors you genuinely like and make several books with them. After that, you'll know much better whether you want something finer, thicker, softer, or more visible. Thread affects both the structure and the appearance of a handmade book. For me, linen is still the easiest choice most of the time, but even linen can come in very different thicknesses, constructions, and finishes. You don't need to understand every thread numbering system. Look at the fiber, compare the actual thickness, think about the book you are making, and decide how visible you want the sewing to be. And if you're unsure about the thread, buying a small amount first can be a much better idea than buying a huge spool. After a few projects, you'll probably find 1 or 2 favorite threads that you reach for again and again. And that is really all you need. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Feel free to like and subscribe if you like this tutorial, and stay tuned for more bookbinding videos. Happy crafting!